So both of you are very active on social media, and there are a lot of people have opinions about you. How do you kind of just like, not let it affect you at all?
Everyone's opinion of me is just so positive. I do let it affect me. I do. Because everyone's like, you're great. And I'm like, I know.
You're not great. Blocked.
Yeah.
Do you block people ever?
No, I've muted some people. Now that it's a function on Twitter and Instagram, there's a couple people that I have muted.
Good.
Yeah. Blake Lively.
But you can mute people on Instagram?
Yeah, it's a new feature.
Really?
I know. Get excited.
Wow.
The chaos didn't start with headlines or court filings. It started with whispers, discontented murmurs that rippled through the tightly woven fabric of a Hollywood production, now unraveling at the seams. The story begins on a set that was supposed to breathe life into Colleen Hoover's acclaimed novel, It Ends With Us. But instead, it has become a battlefield of egos, manipulation, and betrayal. What was meant to be a romantic drama on screen has combusted into a scandal far more dramatic off-screen. At the center of it all, Blake Lively, once a darling of the media, and Justin Baldoni, the visionary director now weathering a storm he never saw coming. Allegations, betrayals, and media warfare swirl around them, clouding the truth. Yet for those willing to look closer, the outlines of a different story emerge. This is Sophia, and welcome to my channel. Talk Sophia. At first glance, Blake Lively's involvement in the film appeared to be another feather in her cap. Known for working with strong collaborators like Paul Feig, she had previously thrived in environments where actors were invited to contribute creatively. But according to an insider who once praised Justin Baldoni for fostering a respectful, inclusive set, it was precisely Justin's openness that became his vulnerability. Unlike Feig, who never gave Blake more than an acting credit, Baldoni, with his newer studio and softer leadership approach, unknowingly opened the door to being steamrolled. Blake saw this opportunity, some allege, and seized it. The result? A power struggle that would soon spiral into a public scandal. While Justin's directorial approach was steeped in compassion, shaped by a faith rooted in unity and humility, it became clear that not everyone shared those values. The real upheaval, sources say, began not with a confrontation on set, but with a calculated smear campaign orchestrated by two pivotal figures, Leslie Sloan and Stephanie Jones. These two publicists, once heralded as masters of image-making, allegedly initiated an assault not just on Justin's character, but also on the credibility of his studio, Wayfarer. Headlines began to surface, accusatory, damning, and eerily uniform in tone. Justin was painted as hostile, chauvinistic, even frightening to work with, and all of it, according to insider reports, was a mirage. The real campaign wasn't about Justin's behavior at all. It was about protecting Blake from the backlash she was facing online from the fans of the book and moviegoers alike. A particularly damning article in the Daily Mail, which alleged on-set tensions and a breakdown in communication, became the linchpin of this strategy. But those closest to the matter insist the article's sources were none other than Blake's own team. Publicist Leslie Sloan was reportedly in constant contact with outlets like TMZ, US Weekly, and Page Six, planting stories and manipulating narratives to shift the blame away from Blake and onto Justin. The plan? Drown out social media criticism with a fire hose of orchestrated press pieces that painted Blake as the victim of a misogynistic director. The problem? There was no actual proof. Blake couldn't link any story directly to Justin's publicist, Jen Ale. In fact, Jen had reportedly spoken to no one. Unlike Leslie, who was actively leaking and coordinating press coverage, Jen had stayed silent. The trail was cold. No emails, no statements, nothing but a clear discrepancy between the stories coming out and the actual behind-the-scenes dynamics, according to insiders. What followed was an all-out war, not just in headlines, but in legal filings and whispered conversations between entertainment executives. Justin and Wayfarer were accused, discredited, and attacked, yet they refused to respond in kind. This wasn't a show of weakness. Sources insist. It was a principle. Wayfair wouldn't fight fire with fire. They wouldn't smear or retaliate. And that restraint, ironically, became more telling than any press release could have been. Then came the revelation that threw gasoline on the flames. Blake Lively allegedly threatened Taylor Swift. For most, this seemed unimaginable. Two powerful women, friends even, now seemingly at odds. But according to insiders and court-adjacent leaks, it was more than a threat. It was a full-court press. Blake's legal team allegedly reached out to Taylor's lawyers, demanding her public support. When Taylor refused, her father, Scott Swift, intervened, reportedly providing vital information to Justin's attorneys in exchange for Taylor's name being cleared from the proceedings. Whether this was an act of damage control or genuine outrage remains debatable, but the message was unmistakable. Taylor Swift would not be a pawn in Blake's narrative. This internal implosion extended far beyond Hollywood's glittering facade. The legal filings began to pile up. Motions were submitted. Advocacy groups entered the fray. Blake's team leaned heavily on laws designed to protect real victims of defamation and harassment, but those same laws include provisions against malicious use. This wasn't a textbook case of speaking truth to power. According to Brian Friedman, representing Justin and Wayfarer, this was a smear campaign cloaked in victimhood. The damage, however, wasn't limited to Justin. It splintered out to others swept up in the vortex. Melissa Nathan, Jen Ale, Jamie Heath, Steve Sarowitz, each facing lawsuits, subpoenas, or reputational fallout. Entire departments at Wayfarer, many led by women, found themselves entangled in a war they never asked for. And as the pressure mounted, a troubling pattern emerged. Blake, some claimed, had a history of using influence and fear to control the narrative. From reporters to celebrities, from publicists to producers, everyone was being drawn into a fight that seemed less about justice and more about self-preservation. Even Taylor Swift, known for her measured silence, was allegedly harassed behind the scenes. And when the media struck down Brian Friedman's motion, Blake's team celebrated. But that move wasn't about winning a motion. It was about sending a message. The other side knows what's really going on, and they're not afraid to show it. No one yet knows how this will end. The court may decide one way, the public may believe another. But for those who've lived inside this chaos, who've seen reputations built and destroyed, one truth remains steady. Power can protect, but it can also corrupt. And when the walls close in, all that's left is who's still standing. That realization was the turning point. Not for the headlines, not for the media circus, but for the foundation of what this entire case had become. It was no longer just about protecting reputations or rescuing a project from bad press. It was about the raw truth of influence, fear, and manipulation in Hollywood. And Blake and Ryan, by allegedly attempting to strong-arm Taylor Swift, an icon of personal narrative and boundary setting, unwittingly stepped over a line that no amount of PR spin could walk back. The accusations from Blake's team had taken many shapes, but none had initially included claims of sexual misconduct. That narrative only emerged after public sympathy started slipping through their fingers. Before that shift, complaints had revolved around creative clashes, supposed chauvinism, or discomfort on set. The moment these lesser claims failed to salvage her image, the accusations escalated. But timing matters, and so does motive. It became glaringly clear to insiders and legal observers alike that these moves were calculated, not reactive, strategically timed to muddy the waters just as pressure mounted. The misuse of advocacy structures added another volatile layer. Blake's legal team invoked laws meant to protect genuine victims, laws steeped in trauma, truth, and the tireless work of survivor-led organizations. But insiders and legal experts emphasized a crucial detail. These laws were never designed to shield false allegations. They were never meant to become shields for those who use victimhood as a weapon to silence critics or gain power. And yet, That's precisely how they were being used, twisted into tools of deflection rather than justice. Stephanie Jones, meanwhile, became a parallel cautionary tale. Once a dominant figure in publicity, the whispers around her downfall grew louder. Sources claim her longtime clients had begun to abandon her, not due to a smear from opposing counsel, but because of her own actions. Her coordination with Leslie Sloan, her alleged betrayal of former associates, and her role in amplifying what many now believe to be a fraudulent narrative had become too toxic to ignore. Most devastating of all, reports suggest Tom Brady, the client who defined her career, had cut ties, quietly but definitively. The larger picture is a web of ambition tangled with desperation. Blake, Ryan, Leslie, and Stephanie may have believed they could bury the truth under paperwork and press, that they could flood the court docket until it drowned out opposing voices. But in doing so, they underestimated two things: the weight of actual evidence and the resolve of those they tried to manipulate. Scott Swift, in particular, emerged not just as a father defending his daughter, but as a decisive figure who, by allegedly providing material proof of Blake's coercion attempts, delivered a critical blow to the narrative. His decision to cooperate turned the tide and forced Blake's team into retreat, not in public, but behind closed doors. As filings continued to pour in, motions, counter-motions, and endless procedural distractions, it became apparent that none of them were meant to win a legal argument. They were delay tactics. Every new motion was a stall, a gamble that time might heal public perception, or that the other side might grow weary. But while Blake's team buried themselves in legal theater, the other side stayed quiet, silent, focused, and more importantly, consistent in their refusal to mimic the tactics being used against them. No press conference, no smear campaign in return, just filings supported by documents, affidavits, and a reliance on the process, not the optics. What perhaps Blake and her team failed to understand is that in the era of transparency, the court of public opinion isn't just about loud headlines anymore. People are paying attention. People are reading dockets. And when they do, they begin to notice patterns. Who is flooding the system with noise, and who is simply stating facts? For those involved in the smear campaign, the reckoning is not just legal, it's reputational. Because once the dust settles, it's not just a film that's ruined, it's trust. In names, in institutions. In the authenticity of celebrity advocacy. What remains now is the slow march toward legal resolution, where truth moves methodically but persistently. The smear campaign that began as whispers grew into a frenzy of filings and falsehoods. But when Taylor Swift's name entered the equation, so did a mirror, one that reflected back the very worst of Hollywood's hunger for control. And in that reflection, Blake and her allies may find not the enemies they tried to create, but the consequences they never expected. But beneath all the drama, lawsuits, and insider leaks lies something even more unsettling: how fame not only insulates, but emboldens. For Blake, Ryan, and those orbiting them, the idea of consequence seemed like a myth, something for others, never for them. The miscalculations weren't just legal or public, they were human. In their pursuit to control a narrative, they lost control of reality. Their belief in their own immunity, built on years of being media untouchables, was the very blind spot that brought them to the edge. What no one anticipated was how tightly coordinated the unraveling would be. Industry professionals who once worked with these figures began quietly distancing themselves. People who had nothing to gain and everything to lose spoke up, not in press conferences, but through affidavits, testimony, digital footprints. The layers peeled back revealed something far more calculated than a few bad PR decisions. It wasn't impulsive. It was planned, documented, and now under legal scrutiny. What sources emphasized repeatedly was that the behavior wasn't new. It had simply never been challenged. And for the first time, those on the receiving end, whether it was a quietly betrayed team member, a journalist pushed too far, or a fellow artist caught in the crossfire, weren't backing down. They weren't playing into the silence that so often protects powerful people. And when power fails to suppress truth, it doesn't just crumble, it collapses publicly. Amid the fallout, the internal divisions deepened. Insiders close to the legal teams revealed growing unease even within Blake and Ryan's camp. Once held together by mutual gain, those bonds were fraying fast. Some believed that perjury was not just a risk, but a likelihood, with parties allegedly willing to say whatever necessary to shield themselves. The very alliances they relied on were turning brittle, and the whispers behind the scenes weren't about loyalty. They were about survival. This wasn't just a media scandal or a bad production gone worse. It became a microcosm of the dysfunction festering in celebrity culture, a system where charm and connections too often override ethics, where image management is prioritized over accountability, and where the truth is treated as just another PR obstacle to maneuver around. But that structure was cracking, and perhaps the most haunting realization for everyone involved, particularly those still trying to spin a counter-narrative, was that the people weren't buying it anymore. The audience that once took glossy statements at face value was now combing court filings, comparing contradictions, and trusting their own eyes. Hollywood can be brutal, but not always in the way you expect. Sometimes it's not the tabloids or the exposés that do the damage. It's the silence after the lie has unraveled, the phone that stops ringing, the roles that don't come, the endorsements that dry up. And when the dust finally settles, what remains isn't just a tarnished reputation. It's an entire legacy reshaped by a single decision: to lie instead of apologize, to attack instead of admit, to escalate instead of walk away. That choice, made over and over again, not just by Blake, but by those who backed her, may prove far more consequential than any verdict handed down in court. Because in the world they inhabit, truth eventually has a way of making itself heard, and once it does, no amount of influence or fame can silence it. As the broader entertainment industry began to take stock of the implications, what emerged was an atmosphere of cautious recalibration. Not because of a single scandal, but because of what this saga revealed about how easily lines between personal grievance and professional responsibility can be manipulated. Production companies, legal advisors, and talent agencies began reevaluating internal protocols, not out of some sweeping ethical revelation, but sheer self-preservation. Quiet calls were made, documents revisited, relationships reconsidered. The ripple effect had started. What many hadn't fully grasped until this point was how far-reaching the collateral damage had become. It wasn't just about Blake Lively or Justin Baldoni anymore. It was about crew members whose careers were stalled due to halted productions, emerging artists and assistants whose names were tied to a now toxic project, contracted vendors who were quietly dropped, and writers who watched the adaptation of a beloved novel become synonymous with chaos and legal threats. These were the unseen, unspoken casualties, the ones whose only mistake was proximity. Among them were also those in philanthropic and advocacy roles who had, early on, lent their voices in support of Blake. They had done so not out of malice or manipulation, but under the assumption they were helping a fellow woman speak her truth. And when the full weight of the countersuits and internal testimonies came to light, they were left grappling with more than embarrassment. They had been misled, weaponized, made into shields in a battle they didn't start. Some began issuing quiet clarifications. Others simply vanished from the conversation altogether. But the effect lingered, a subtle, disquieting awareness that their credibility had been shaken. For Wayfarer Studios, the situation became a lesson in restraint under siege. They had weathered the PR assault, refused to play by the rules of celebrity spin, and maintained internal cohesion despite the personal and reputational stakes. As more industry professionals began seeing them not as aggressors, but as a studio under coordinated attack, quiet sympathy turned into professional curiosity. What made them different? How had they held their ground without a media blitz or counter-narrative campaign? The answer, according to insiders, lay in consistency. They hadn't just said they were principled, they had acted like it, even when doing so meant enduring a storm of unearned vilification. Meanwhile, the remaining legal teams involved in defending Blake, Ryan, and their publicists were beginning to face the slow, grinding consequences of representation built on an unstable foundation. Legal analysts started scrutinizing their filings, not for strategy, but for contradictions. Statements made in public interviews were being matched against formal declarations. As more data surfaced, what began as defense arguments were now being dissected as potential exposure points. The facade of control was cracking, but not from external opposition. It was cracking under its own weight. In the entertainment law circles, this case became a live case study, an example of how reputation defense, when untethered from truth, can backfire spectacularly. Conversations shifted in private meetings and industry panels, centering around legal ethics, client selection, and crisis management failures. Questions emerged. How far should lawyers go to protect a client's narrative? What is the cost of advocacy built on fabricated premises? And at what point does enabling become complicity? For Blake and Ryan, the legal entanglements were only part of the reckoning. Brand partnerships were quietly evaluating renewal clauses. Campaigns that had been in the pipeline were paused indefinitely. Invitations, once automatic, became tentative. No mass cancellations, no overt public rebukes, just a slow, silent retreat of trust. An industry that thrives on certainty was beginning to view them as a liability, not an asset. Even their philanthropic initiatives, once praised for celebrity benevolence, faced behind-the-scenes questioning. Was this generosity or strategic image engineering? Perhaps the most damning fallout, however, was personal. Not in tabloids, but in the rooms that matter. Conversations changed. Associates spoke differently. The private laughter of allies turned into calculated distance. Not because of a single crime or scandal, but because of the slow realization that they'd gambled reputations on an illusion and lost. The machinery of celebrity is precise. It builds quickly, shines brightly, and collapses quietly. And once it begins to fall, no PR maneuver, no legal shield, no carefully timed exclusive can stop it. All that's left is what remains when the audience and the industry finally look past the performance and see what was always there. And when they do, the silence speaks louder than anything ever said on camera.